There is no need for this depression. By a few simple actions which I would take within the hour I were inaugurated president, and with your support to whip the majority of the Congress into line, I would set into motion the same general economic recovery which Roosevelt accomplished during the period between 1939 and 1943.
Lyndon LaRouche is the only presidential candidate who has had the guts to call our current economic mess a depression and who has the program to get us out of it. That is why Lyndon LaRouche was put into a federal prison on the initiative of Henry A. Kissinger and his friends. Lyndon LaRouche is a political prisoner. He committed no crime. He is in jail because his ideas represent a political danger. Evidence already placed before the courts, including government documents and the testimony of government agents, prove conclusively that LaRouche is innocent. The government has admitted that it holds tens of thousands of additional unreleased documents from its secret war against LaRouche. George Bush has been repeatedly asked to release those files which would show LaRouche's innocence. But George Bush has refused. What has Lyndon LaRouche done that George Bush must keep him silenced in a prison cell? Let's go back in time 10 years to 1982. Although the American news media refused to report on any of his far-ranging initiatives, LaRouche was very well known and influential among leadership circles, particularly in the Third World, and also throughout the international scientific community. LaRouche was especially respected for his work in formulating science policy. He had, for instance, identified the importance of laser and particle beams in strategic missile defense as far back as 1977. In 1982, LaRouche worked in close cooperation with the Reagan administration, conducting back-channel discussions with the Soviet Union to explore joint U.S.-Soviet development of ballistic missile defense as an alternative to nuclear warfare. These ideas were adopted by the Reagan administration under the name Strategic Defense Initiative. At the same time, Lyndon LaRouche continued to organize for the reform of the international monetary system. Since his days in India during World War II, LaRouche had been dedicated to creating new international monetary institutions, which would provide the equitable benefits of technological and scientific progress to the nations of the developing sector. LaRouche repeatedly warned that the U.S. economy could not survive by merely looting the developing sector through an ever-increasing debt burden. LaRouche identified that this policy was not only immoral, it would also destroy the potential markets of the industrialized nations, and it would hasten a global financial collapse. Let LaRouche continue the story in his own words.
During the spring of 1982, I was the first to use the term debt bomb to describe the debt crisis which was about to explode. During June or July of that year, I conveyed to various governments of Ibero-America and to our own government my recommendations for immediate action to prevent this debt crisis from triggering a collapse in the solvency of the U.S. banking system and thus triggering the conditions for a new worldwide financial collapse. During August 1982, the debt bomb exploded in Mexico. For a period of approximately an hour during that month, the entire world financial system was on the edge of a total collapse. However, the Reagan administration refused to accept my proposals, which could have stopped the world financial crisis right at that time. Instead, the Reagan administration brought in Henry A. Kissinger and adopted Kissinger's policies. My proposal for solving the financial crisis of the Western Hemisphere is called Operation Juarez. This is the name of a report which I prepared at the request of leading circles in South America and Mexico, a report which I submitted to those governments and to our own government at the beginning of August, just weeks before the Mexico crisis exploded. Since August 1982, Henry Kissinger, Kissinger's associate Lane Kirkland, and officials of the State and Treasury Department have concentrated the major part of their political efforts in Washington and in Mexico and South America in an effort to prevent the policies I present in Operation Juarez from being adopted.
When he spoke these words in 1984, LaRouche did not know that, in addition to personally touring Ibero-America to subvert Operation Juarez, Henry Kissinger had also sent a letter.
To William Webster, Director, Federal Bureau of Investigation, August 19, 1982. Dear Bill, I appreciated your letter forwarding the flyer which has been circulated by Lyndon LaRouche, Jr. Because these people have been getting increasingly obnoxious, I have taken the liberty of asking my lawyer, Bill Rogers, to get in touch with you to ask your advice, especially with respect to security. It was good to see you at the Grove, and I look forward to the chance to visit again when I am next in Washington. Warm regards, Henry A. Kissinger.
3 months later, Kissinger formalized this demand.
November 25, 1982. Dear Judge Webster, we may be witnessing here not normal radical political action, but a systematic disinformation campaign supported by some foreign intelligence service. Who finances this network of organizations, newsletters, and newspapers? Henry A. Kissinger.
Kissinger's precise formulation, supported by some foreign intelligence service, was designed to legitimate anti-LaRouche operations under Executive Order 12333. 12333 was signed by President Reagan in 1981, allowing the U.S. intelligence community to violate its own published guidelines while operating against any group suspected of foreign intelligence ties. Executive Order 12333 was the document which William Casey and Oliver North used to justify the Iran-Contra arms scandal. Kissinger's message got quick results.
January 12, 1983. To Oliver Revelle, FBI Investigative Division. At the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board meeting today, David Abshire raised the subject of the activities of the U.S. Labor Party and Lyndon LaRouche. He noted that he and a number of other Americans in public life had been the subject of repeated harassment by LaRouche and wondered whether the FBI had a basis for investigating these activities under the guidelines or otherwise. A number of the members present, including Edward Bennett Williams, raised the question of the sources of funding of these U.S. Labor Party activities. In view of the large amounts obviously being expended worldwide, the question was raised whether the U.S. Labor Party might be funded by hostile intelligence agencies.
This document triggered a massive dirty tricks campaign aimed especially at the LaRouche organization's finances. The late Edward Bennett Williams, one of the participants of this secret meeting, explained the goal in a taped telephone conversation 3.5 years later.
This fellow, LaRouche, and his gang are about to be indicted up there in Massachusetts. I'm going to have dinner with Henry next week, and I'm going to talk to him about this whole thing because I think the opportunity is now surfacing.
The official excuse for the FBI's war on LaRouche, suspicion of foreign intelligence ties, was absurd because one of Kissinger's top allies in the campaign was the Soviet KGB. Again, LaRouche tells the story in his own words.
Nearly 2 years ago, during a 2-day seminar in Washington, D.C., I proposed a new strategic doctrine for the United States to an audience which included Soviet officials as well as representatives of our own government agencies. I proposed that we dump Kissinger's and McNamara's flexible response doctrine and end the age of thermonuclear terror through deploying the kinds of anti-missile defenses which science had made possible. My proposals caught fire immediately among influential circles. With the knowledge of our government, I conducted exploratory discussions privately with Soviet representatives for a period of over 12 months. When Dr. Teller announced similar proposals in the fall of 1982, our news media was no longer able to suppress information about the fact of this discussion of a new doctrine from the American public. On March the 23rd, our president not only announced such a new strategic doctrine for the United States itself. But in that same nationwide television broadcast, he offered to negotiate with Moscow to bring the age of thermonuclear revenge weapons to an end. If the Soviet leaders had accepted the president's offer at that time, tonight you and your family could sleep in knowledge that the age of thermonuclear terror was being brought to an end. But the Soviet Union did not wish peace.
Even though LaRouche's beam defense proposal was posed as a science driver, a joint program whose shared technologies would help the economies of both countries, the Soviets saw it as a new technological race which they could not win. The decision was made to stop the SDI at all costs and to help destroy the man who the Soviets saw as the intellectual author of the proposal, Lyndon LaRouche. Right after President Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, in a speech on March 23, 1983, the Soviets broke off all back-channel contact with LaRouche. Slandering articles began appearing in the Soviet press in June. Both the anti-SDI and anti-LaRouche campaigns became the direct responsibility of Fyodor Berlatsky, a longtime advisor to Yuri Andropov, the head of the KGB who had become Soviet party chief. It was Berlatsky who gave the Soviet Union's official line on SDI.
This would create a practically irresistible temptation for the American military men and politicians to inflict a first strike. In other words, space weapons are provocative weapons. They are absolutely a casus belli for nuclear war.
Casus belli, the legal justification for war. When Lyndon LaRouche and his wife, German political leader Helga Zepp LaRouche, attacked Berlatsky for making this threat, the Soviet official responded,
I did not know if I should be indignant or laugh about the amusing and ridiculous maxims of the authors. The conjugal symbiosis of the American LaRouche and his wife, the German Helga Zepp LaRouche, who come out of a non-existent party. We will not pay attention to their trivial pretensions.
However, Berlatsky and the communist media actually paid quite a bit of attention to Lyndon LaRouche.
They came to Rome from various countries on the invitation from a certain Lyndon LaRouche. As a hobby horse of his electoral campaign, LaRouche has chosen space weaponry. He was delighted with the proposals Reagan made on March 23rd of this year. The get-together showed that both Reagan and LaRouche have followers in the old world.
Even the free press directly calls these neo-fascist organizations protected by the CIA and calls its leader, the American Lyndon LaRouche, Führer.
Meanwhile, certain sections of the American intelligence community were arranging their own press attacks on LaRouche. According to the testimony of Mira Lansky-Boland, a former employee of the CIA, now an official of the Anti-Defamation League of the B'nai B'rith, planning meetings were conducted at the New York City apartment of investment banker John Train, starting in 1983. Boland, who was present, testified that the meetings included representatives from the National Security Council, the Anti-Defamation League, the Wall Street Journal, NBC Television Network, and others. The Train meetings planned a campaign to characterize LaRouche in the news media as a political extremist. Prejudicing public opinion of LaRouche in this way was necessary to justify the secret government's already planned railroad of LaRouche. This news media dirty tricks campaign went into high gear with a half-hour special broadcast on NBC Network. The broadcast used the tried-and-true black propaganda technique of assembling so many different kinds of wild accusations against LaRouche that, even if the whole thing didn't make sense, at least one charge would stick in the mind of the audience. Then, back to Moscow.
Lyndon LaRouche is striving to undermine the influence of communists and other left forces among workers and student youth. The scandalous ties of the Reagan administration with LaRouche were exposed in a special report on NBC television. The acknowledgement by the White House not only exposes the true face of LaRouche, but it also shows that the current Washington administration does not shy away from the services of neo-fascist provocateurs.
This Soviet demand that the Reagan administration immediately break off all relations with LaRouche was identical to one made 4 days before by Charles Manat, the chairman of the Democratic National Committee and a violent foe of the Strategic Defense Initiative. Manat told the Chicago Tribune that the shocking White House involvement with the bizarre extremist Lyndon LaRouche must end. So, by March 1984, we have the amazing spectacle of the chairman of the Democratic Party, Henry A. Kissinger, the Soviet KGB, the American FBI, the Anti-Defamation League of the B'nai B'rith, NBC Network, all publicly saying the same thing at the same time. Get Lyndon LaRouche. Against this opposition, LaRouche waged his 1984 presidential campaign, highlighting the growing danger to the world economy.
Now, some fellows will tell you that the kinds of things I'm talking about won't work. They will say to you that everything is just fine, that Kissinger and his friends have solved the problem of the Latin American debt. Well, those fellows either don't know what they're talking about, don't know much of anything at all about this matter, or else, as in the case of Kissinger's friends, they're simply lying outright. Our own internal banking system is in desperate condition. Don't let this whistling in the dark fool you. We're in trouble.
Meanwhile, in the fall of 1984, a grand jury was convened. It would sit month after month, trying unsuccessfully to manufacture indictments against LaRouche. At the same time, the secret government's press campaign in America escalated, with thousands of articles and reports calling LaRouche everything in the book. At the beginning of 1986, the Soviets tried a particularly nasty trick. On March 28th of that year, Swedish Premier Olof Palme, a longtime opponent of Lyndon LaRouche, was assassinated in Stockholm. The very next day, Georgy Arbatov, the Soviet Union's top expert on America, told a press conference, "I don't know who killed Olof Palme, but I know who hated him." And then Arbatov proceeded to unmistakably describe the activities of the European Labour Party, Lyndon LaRouche's co-thinker party in Sweden. Within a week, the Stockholm police chief, Hans Holmér, announced that the European Labour Party was a suspect in the assassination. This became front-page news in Europe and the Soviet Union. The Soviets went so far as to produce a prime-time docudrama accusing LaRouche.
Европейская рабочая партия уже сила. Более 10 стран, штаб-квартира в США. Точная цель – борьба с коммунизмом. Борясь с красными, они не забывают и о розовых. Послушайте, что говорит их лидер LaRouche.
The story was broken in the United States by NBC, which interviewed Anti-Defamation League official Erwin Sewell. Sewell immediately flew to Stockholm to help Police Chief Holmér with his investigation. All this was still front-page news. What wasn't front-page news was the fact that, weeks later, the European Labour Party was dropped from suspicion amid protests that Police Chief Holmér had tampered with evidence in order to link the Labour Party with the assassination, and amid criticism of the U.S. media. Finally, just a few months ago in 1992, it was discovered that the Scandinavian journalist who led the attacks on LaRouche in the Palme affair, one Jörgen Dragsdahl, had been a top KGB secret agent from 1986 on. In April of 1986, despite the slander campaign, candidates publicly affiliated with LaRouche received impressive votes in several primary elections and won a statewide contest in Illinois. The news media went a little crazy.
The press club was packed, reflecting a growing interest in LaRouche, who says he comes from a long political tradition.
If Abe Lincoln were alive, he'd probably be standing up here with me today.
LaRouche said voter support for his organization comes from farmers, blacks, and blue-collar workers.
They want me to stick it to Washington. That's what the voters want.
And that's exactly what he did today, claiming that President
I think
Reagan's...
they're scared to death of Lyndon LaRouche.
Political extremist Lyndon LaRouche. Political extremist Lyndon LaRouche.
Political extremist Lyndon LaRouche.
Sovetskaya Kultura, September 30, 1986. LaRouche is now clearly going through a definite period of growth. For many in the U.S., the really concrete question arises, how is it possible that the LaRoucheites can act so openly and fearlessly? In this respect, the Washington Post wrote, why isn't the Internal Revenue Service interested in the affairs of this man?
The next week, on October 6, 1986, the IRS, along with 400 members of the FBI, the Secret Service, and the Virginia State and local police, armed with automatic weapons, helicopters, and armored cars, raided the offices of 3 organizations identified with LaRouche. The purpose was to seize hundreds of pounds of documents and to deliver indictments which had finally been manufactured in Boston. In April 1987, the federal government culminated years of financial warfare by convincing a judge, in secret, to force 3 publishing companies operated by associates of LaRouche into involuntary bankruptcy. Lyndon LaRouche campaigned for president throughout 1988, despite the attempted destruction of his campaign machine and the fact that he was simultaneously on trial in Boston. That 1988 campaign remains memorable for its accurate forecast of the current economic depression and for the startling predictions of the breakup of the East Bloc and the reunification of Germany. During 1988, LaRouche's trial in Boston came to a standstill around the issues of government misconduct and its hiding of evidence. Links to the Iran-Contra scandal were found. The judge even ordered a search of Vice President Bush's files. In May, the case was declared a mistrial. To the prosecutor's horror, it was found out that the jury had already made up its mind.
We would have acquitted everybody at this point, and that's based on prosecution evidence. There was too much question of government misconduct in what was happening in the LaRouche campaign.
The U.S. government did not attempt to retry the Boston case, but moved it to Alexandria, Virginia, where a more cooperative judge excluded all of the arguments which won for LaRouche in Boston. LaRouche himself was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. 6 co-defendants received lesser terms. Lyndon LaRouche entered prison in January 1989. Before that year was out, LaRouche's 1988 predictions were coming true. The Berlin Wall was down. The Soviet Union was starting the final phase of disintegration, and the current economic depression was starting in earnest. In October 1989, 30 months after the involuntary bankruptcies of the LaRouche organizations, the bankruptcy judge found that the federal prosecutors, not LaRouche and his associates, had perpetrated constructive fraud on the court. The government's arguments to shut down LaRouche had been made in bad faith. The bankruptcies, which were the primary reason for the LaRouche organization's financial difficulties, were themselves illegal. On January 22, 1992, attorneys for LaRouche, including former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark, filed a motion in federal court seeking to free LaRouche on the grounds that his conviction and detention were unlawful. The motion is supported by 6 volumes of evidence discovered after LaRouche was convicted, but suppressed or concealed by the government. At the same time, from his prison, Lyndon LaRouche launched a new bid for the Democratic presidential nomination. He will be on the ballot in 31 primaries by the time of the Democratic National Convention. His emergency program to end the Depression in the United States through the creation of 6 million new industrial jobs is being picked up by some Democratic candidates. His programs for the redevelopment of the nations of the former communist bloc are now widely discussed throughout Europe, especially Eastern Europe. Ironically, the international campaign of negative propaganda, which turned Lyndon LaRouche into a devil in the United States, has turned him into a hero in the former communist countries, where people understood that the media was controlled. In late 1990, a leader of the Ukrainian freedom movement, Taras Chornovil, while on tour in Canada, explained,
"To the degree that the Soviet press primarily covered major developments of the West, such as the SDI program, then the name of Lyndon LaRouche was portrayed in a severely negative light. We, however, have learned to read between the lines of the official press and understood that if the name of a political dissident is caricatured in such a negative way, then the individual must have serious political views. I think that if the people of the West view Lyndon LaRouche literally as a political dissident, then it is very sad, because he played an important role in international politics at the time for us Ukrainians."
This is Lyndon LaRouche speaking. We have now gone through a primary campaign, best and most fairly described as a gong show. One front runner after the other has been dropped out. And it now is coming down to Jerry Brown and me. Why has the Democratic primary been a gong show? Don't blame the candidates entirely. Yes, they're defective, but why are they defective? Because for over 25 years, this country has been going in the wrong direction in its economic and related policies. Back in the time of President John Kennedy, we were a growing industrial power. If we continued that rate of growth that we had under John Kennedy, and we could have, we would have a GNP of over $8 trillion today. And not only have the policies been bad over the past 25 years, but every change has been worse than the other as we proceeded from becoming an industrial power to becoming a post-industrial power. The result is that over a generation of the people who've grown up to take charge of our corporations, to take charge of our political parties and so forth, no longer know how to do things right. And therefore what they've said really is foolishness, which means nothing at all, which does not address the reality that 25 years of bad policy have plunged us into the worst depression of the 20th century. And for that, ladies and gentlemen, don't blame the Japanese, don't blame the Germans. We have no one to blame but ourselves. A certain gentleman said years ago, it is better to vote for what you desire and lose than to vote for what you hate and win. Vote for me.
For more information, write LaRouche in 92, P.O. Box 690, Leesburg, Virginia, 22075.